So I would like to first to welcome everyone, and I would like to give a few words about how this InfoShare is structured. So we will start with a short introduction to the AARC Blueprint Architecture. We will then present the community-first approach to the Blueprint Architecture and how this can help research communities to access resources and services that are offered by different infrastructures. David will then present the authorization models that we have identified that can enable community managed authorization in a scalable way. There will be a summary and information, more in-depth information about AARC, and then we will have a Q&A session. So what is the problem that AARC is addressing? Researchers need to access and share resources in order to collaborate together. Individual researchers can already use their institutional account, thanks to EduGain, to access thousands of resources available to their own organization. But members of research collaborations need to manage, access, and share resources based on their roles in these collaborations. So to support this, research collaborations need an authentication and authorization infrastructure that allows researchers to easily access all the online resources they need. AARC has devised an approach to building such an infrastructure, the AARC Blueprint Architecture, or BPA for short. So the AARC Blueprint Architecture defines the key components for building an infrastructure in a scalable and secure way. These building blocks can be mixed and matched according to the community needs. This flexibility helps software architects and technical decision makers to build a customized solution for the research collaboration. EduGain and the National Identity Federations enable the federation of identities and services globally. AARC is leveraging EduGain as the foundation for federated identities and adds the dimension of the research collaborations. The relationship between the users, home institutions, and service providers, which is typically found in the National Identity Federations and EduGain, now becomes a relationship between a research community, the users, home institutions, and service providers. The AARC BPA builds on top of EduGain and adds the functionality required to support common use cases within research collaborations, such as access to non-web-based services and access to resources based on community membership. So, the AARC BPA champions a proxy architecture in which services in a research collaboration can connect to a single point, which is the proxy. The proxy itself takes the responsibility for providing the connection to the identity federations and EduGain. This reduces the need for each service having to separately connect to a federation or EduGain. Now, the first version of the AARC BPA that you see in this diagram was published in the summer of 2016. The current version of the BPA provides a more detailed architecture while retaining full backwards compatibility. As you can see in the diagram, we have identified 5 component layers based on the functional role. So there is the user identity layer, which groups services that provide electronic identities that can be used by users participating in international research collaborations. Then there is this bluish layer, the community attribute services layer, that contains components related to managing and providing information about users, such as community group memberships and roles, on top of the information that might come from the user identity layer. Then at the center, there is the access protocol translation layer, which defines an administrative policy and technical boundary between the internal and external services and resources. Now, of course, this layer plays a prominent role in the architecture since this is where the proxy resides. And finally, there is the authorization layer, which contains elements for controlling the different ways that users can access services and resources. David will give more details about the internals of the authorization layer later on. And then finally, we have the end services layer, which contains the external services that interact with the other elements of the AAI. Now, moving on to the community-first approach. So, the community-first approach to the AARC Blueprint Architecture aims at streamlining how researchers can access services via their community AAI, using their institutional credentials from Edugain or social media or other community-managed identity providers as allowed by the specific community needs. The community AI is therefore responsible for dealing with the complexity of using different identity providers with the required community services. Furthermore, the community AI enables the addition of attributes to the federated identity that it in turn can enable service providers to control access to the resources, which can range from typical web services to data repositories, scientific instruments, and so on. Now, these community-specific services only need to connect to a single identity provider, which is the IDP proxy side of the community AI. Now, apart from the community-specific services, there are generic services, for example, the AARC online CA, which serve the need of different communities, and therefore they need to be connected to more than one community AI. Now, it is important to state that community services often require access to services and resources which are offered by the infrastructures. Now, access to these infrastructure services is typically mediated through a dedicated infrastructure proxy. So, while infrastructure proxies can be connected to different community AIs, the infrastructure services that you can see at the bottom of the diagram only need to be connected to a single infra proxy. So what are the benefits of this community-first approach? First of all, it allows researchers to sign in using their institutional credentials, social media, or other community-managed identity providers via their community AAI. For community services, there is a single integration point, which is the community AAI. Of course, generic services which serve multiple communities will need to be connected to multiple community AIs. But then for infra services, again, they have a single point of integration, which is the proxy. And you can see in this example that these generic infrastructure services could be EGI services, for which the gateway is the check-in proxy, EUDAT services, which can be accessed through B2 access, Xeant services, accessed through the Xeant Identity Hub. Now, you might be wondering what is the relation between this community-first approach and the functional view of the AARC Blueprint Architecture. So as you can see in this slide, where we have the two diagrams side by side, we have the Edugain identity providers, social media, and so on, which can be directly mapped to the user identity layer that we see in the functional view of the AARC BPA. Then at the center, there is the community AAI, which enables the use of community identities for accessing resources. Now, as you can see, the community AI comprises three functional layers of the BPA. So you can see that there's the community attribute services layer, of course, the access protocol translation layer with the proxy, and the authorization. Now, at the bottom, you can see that we have the community services, generic services, and the infra proxies, and the services that are protected behind them, which can be mapped to the end services layer at the bottom. So another thing to point out here is that the infra proxy itself is an AARC BPA compliant AI service that comprises two layers from this infrastructure. And this is the access protocol translation layer and the authorization layer. Now I would like to give the floor to David, who's going to go into the details of the authorization layer.
Yes, thank you, Nicholas. Now, compared to the first iteration of the BPA, basically the one that was created in the first phase of the AARC project, like Nicholas said, one of the topics that we've looked at in much more detail is authorization, which is the green layer in all of the diagrams Nicholas just showed. So for that, we have analyzed existing authorization use cases in various of the communities in AARC. And the result of this is that we've identified three common authorization models. Now, authorization models basically describe how authorization information flows within infrastructures, and of course, these infrastructures are all based on the AARC Blueprint Architecture. Before actually presenting these models, I'd first like to tell you a little bit about the different categories of authorization information that we have identified. Now, the first category is called user attributes, and basically contains information that is not directly authorization decisions, but rather information that can serve as an input to actually come up with these decisions. One example of these user attributes is group and role information. We have created a guidelines documents back in the first project phase of AARC that basically specifies a syntax on how to express these group and role information. Other examples for user attributes might be assurance or affiliation information of users. The second category is capabilities, and capabilities essentially express access rights a person has or a user has on specific resources or child resources. And access rights might actually be as specific as certain actions they are allowed to perform on these resources. Now, similarly to what we did for group and role information in the AARC G002 guidelines document, we have specified a similar syntax as shown in the second blue box, basically in a new document called AARC G027. Now, looking at all of this authorization information, and now at the diagram on this slide, we can basically introduce the three different authorization models. Now, coming from this diagram, which basically consists of all the layers that are present in the BPA, except the green authorization layer, which this is all about. It shows the flow of a user through, the typical flow of a user through the BPA infrastructure. The goal of this user is to access, in the end, some resource on an end service. And this user is redirected through a proxy, eventually to an IDP for authentication. Now, with what Nicolas explained with the community first approach in mind, of course, this redirection from the proxy to the IDP used for authentication can, of course, go through, for example, a different proxy, which then would be the community AI, which in turn would redirect the user to the actual IDP used for authentication. In any of these cases, eventually the user gets back to the proxy, and the proxy has access to various types of information. Some of this information qualifies as authorization information as previously presented. The proxy can, of course, if it is a community, query its own attribute authority, get additional information, and perhaps also query other sources. Now, the three models I will talk about shortly basically vary in step 7, which is how this information gets back from the proxy to the actual end service. The first model we have identified is called Centralized Policy Information Point. And the information point in that case, of course, is the central proxy in the middle. The authorization information in this model is generally in the form of user attributes, for example, group and role information, is aggregated by the proxy and then just passed to the end service as is. This means that the end service has all of the information available, which is of course an advantage because you can basically implement a very fine-grained access control at the end service. However, of course, the disadvantage is that the end service needs to be able to understand all of this information and be able to formulate decisions based on this information. Another issue might be scalability, since once you want to implement a change that affects different services, for example, a change in the authorization policy, you need to, of course, touch different services. The second model is called Centralized Policy Management and Decision Making. And what is added here is the decision making bit. Now, similarly to the previous model, the proxy first gathers all kinds of information, but instead of just passing the information on to the end services, it now re-expresses the information as capability, and during that process, of course, takes the authorization policy in mind. Only these capabilities, which basically are access decisions, are then sent to the end service, which can just use the decisions made and enforce access management or access policies. The third model is called centralized policy management, decision making, and enforcement, and adds this, this last layer of enforcement to the proxy as well. This allows the proxy to, for example, completely block access to a service, which is, of course, the enforcement bit. Scenarios where this can be useful are, for example, when services are not capable to enforce the decisions themselves, or if there are like community-wide central decisions, for example, black or white listing based on certain parameters. Of course, in this model, the proxy has the most responsibilities because in addition to gathering the information, for example, and reformulating or re-expressing the information, it also needs to understand the exact authorization policies in the end services. And as a final note, of course, in this model, if the proxy, at least in theory, allows a user to access the end service, it can, of course, be followed by either of the previous two models. So then the proxy can send either user attributes or capabilities or a combination to the end services to allow more fine-grained access control. So this is the end of the short introduction to the authorization work in the BPA, in the reloaded BPA, and I will give back to Nicolas to sum up the webinar.
Thank you, David. So it is worth noting that apart from this interoperability architecture, the ARC BPA also comes with a set of technical and policy guidelines. So at the technical front, we have guidelines for identifying users through globally unique persistent user identifiers. This allows users to link different identities to their community identity, but so that they have a unique reference within their collaboration. There are also guidelines for expressing group membership and roles within a collaboration, as mentioned by David. And this scheme that we have come up with allows for representing group hierarchies and also enables traceability because it allows to identify the source of this group information. There's also a standardized way for expressing capability, so the rights that the user has on specific resources or child resources. So again, there is support for representing resource hierarchies. There are also guidelines for implementing non-web browser-based access, for example, how to access HTTP APIs using Auth2 tokens or X509 proxy certificates. There are best practices for delegation, for example, using the Auth2 token exchange flow. And while all these technical guidelines are necessary for implementing an authentication and authorization infrastructure, it is also important to point out the need for the policies related to security, privacy, and governance. So there is the Sanctify framework, which covers aspects such as managing data protection and the sharing of information in these collaborations. There are also guidelines for handling security incidents in a federated way through the Certified Security Framework. There's a lot of work where the RFED's assurance framework has been extended by ARC to introduce profiles that are more related to the research and education use cases within the context of international research collaborations. There is also a model for evaluating the assurance when the user links multiple identities, so how to evaluate and express the combined assurance in this use case. And of course, implementing all these policies can be a challenge, but luckily there is the AARC Policy Development Kit, which provides introductory information, training materials, and template documents, so that someone who wants to implement the AARC BPA does not need to write these documents from scratch. And there is a link to the policy work in AARC. Now, 4 years after the AARC initiative has started, we are witnessing a wide adoption of the AARC BPA as the reference model for building AIs for research collaboration in Europe and beyond. For example, the AARC BPA architecture is being used by DARIA, EGI, Elixir, EGDAT, ZAN, Life Sciences, the community that brings together 13 different research infrastructures from the life science domain, and LIGO. In parallel to that, there's a number of pilots that have been carried out in the context of AARC, where more research collaborations, for example, WSEG, CTA, EPOS, have been testing the implementation of an AARC-compliant community AAI. You can find more information about these use cases in the AARC in Action section of the AARC website, which is linked from this slide. If you want to see an introductory video about AARC, this is part of the IM Online YouTube channel that Licia mentioned. So if you are interested in webinars related to YAM, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications if you want to get notified about future events. An event that might be of interest to you is the webinar on the AARC extensions to assurance, which is scheduled for May 13th. There's the link to the event page where you can register. So thanks for your attention. And now, if you have any questions, we'll be more than happy to answer.
Thanks, Nicholas. Thanks, David. This was very clear. For the question, I take that people can unmute themselves and talk, but there is also the chat, so you can put the questions in the chat and we can, they will answer the questions and the speakers will address them. Are there any questions? While I see if people have questions, I would like maybe to ask you a question. And this is about the, let's say, the policy aspect. You guys have presented the BPA, the more on the technical point of view. But of course, I mean, just implementing the software, the components and integrating them is not sufficient. Maybe could you just give a very quick overview on the policy? What are the key components that should be addressed, how, etc.?
Yes, sure. So as I mentioned, there are different policies that need to be taken care of for implementing the AARC Blueprint Architecture. So there are aspects related to the protection of data, so compliance with GDPR, the handling of incidents in a federated way. So there's also the acceptable use policy, but there is this policy development kit which has been developed by AARC. So it's easy for someone to have an initial version of this document that they need to, of course, they need to accommodate to their needs, but they don't have to come up with the documents from scratch or start Googling around for how to implement the various policies. So the AARC Policy Development Kit, the PDK, is a very useful starting point. Together with its training materials, this is where a research collaboration should start from in order to have a BPA that's also compliant with the policy frameworks.
Thank you, Nicholas. There are two questions. You can access the Q&A part of the webinar, can't you? But I can also read that. The first one is from Alex, and is there a recommended attribute for the user attributes capability? I do personal entitlement looks suitable in SAML. So,
yeah, maybe I can reply to that. Which basically the answer is already in the question. Both of these specifications, so both for the group and membership and role information, and then also for the capabilities, it is correct that these are expressed using the entitlement attribute. So it's at your person entitlement and SAML, or for example in OpenID Connect, the respective entitlement attribute there.
So Alex, if this does not answer your question, feel free to unmute yourself or to type or to comment on that. And there is a question from Alan. Have you seen that, Nicholas, David? About the
question from Missy about federated ODC concepts.
Yeah, but the questions come on two channels. There is also a question from Alan related to the, if you go down on the bar, there is the Q&A part, and you can see that there are questions there. But it's about having a BPA for dummies type of guide.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so I think we already have this for the policy aspect. So for the PDK, I think this kind of works as a guide for dummies. Now for the architecture itself, we have all the guidelines gathered in the guidelines part of the website, but it is true that perhaps we need to what we're currently missing is to structure this guidance so that it is easy for someone to start tackling the different aspects. So I think this is something that we need to add to the architecture part of the website, so that it's easier for someone also to tackle the different technical challenges in a step-by-step manner. So this is something we need to do.
Yeah, maybe there are some, of course, there are all a set of guidelines. Some of them are let's say, are discussed by the AI operators in research and infrastructure that are implementing an AI that complies with the AARC BPA, so that as a proxy, basically. Yep. And we discuss whether these guidelines can be easily deployed or not. So there is a set of guidelines that have been endorsed by them. This group is called AGIS. I can put the URL to the set of guidelines, but this said there isn't really something BPA for dummies, as Alan suggests at this point in time. And for this we will need another AARC project. Maybe we should make the case for that. There are two questions here.
Just to add something for this point, that we, for example, for some of the complex guidelines, for example, the guidelines related to the assurance, we have started working on a short video that aims to make the guidelines more easier to understand. So we have started with the more complex guidelines, and I think we can make another couple of videos for the guidelines that are too complex. So, and this will be published under the IM Online YouTube channel, so stay tuned. So sorry, Lisa, so what was the other question?
So yes, there was this question on the OIDC, how federated OIDC concept fits into the AARC architecture.
Right, so let me go to share my screen again.
We see the slide still, yeah.
Okay, let me go to the functional view. So, as you can see, with this, the proxy approach, the proxy model, apart from serving as a single integration point between the IDPs and the SPs, also allows for translating between different protocols. So with the proxy, you can have users using a SAML identity provider, and then accessing an OpenID connector OAuth2 based service. So this translation between different federation protocols is something that is already supported by the proxy approach.
Does this answer the question, Mizi? Yeah, okay. And then there is on the other channel, on the Q&A channel, the PAL that asks about the community AI. There seems to be the spider in the net that registers and handles user information, including groups and authorization, and whether this is in line with GDPR, basically.
Again, we should emphasize that the community, the operators of the community AI, of course, need to have a proper privacy statement in place that is completely transparent about the attributes that are collected about the users that register, and that this information is only used for having access to services which are offered to the community. So these community-specific services that we see in this diagram, or to any other services that are offered by other infrastructures.
Yeah, actually, maybe because I think Paul's question is in fact, it's not so much for the community AI, because that's a proxy architecture that follows the AARC BPA, but is in general will be for any proxy in the middle. And because we didn't touch upon the policy aspects a lot, it's probably not clear. Indeed, the proxy, whenever there is a proxy, there is something in the middle that hides services from the IDPs, or in the case of this cascade approach, hides services from the community AI, if there are more proxy, or from the infrastructure AIs, depending on the point of view where you see it. So, but the proxy is where most of the policies are really applied, because it's indeed the most critical part, is where everything flows in. To start with, all if you look at the PDK, that's where certify applies, where sanctify applies for all the policy frameworks. So the proxy itself doesn't really record any attributes. They are in fact handled by the group management system, and there are DPA in place, and there are agreements. So, and everything follows strict rules to be sure that everything is indeed all GDPR compliant. There is actually one of the things that the policy we enforce by the AARC BPA. In fact, that was one of the reasons why we were thinking about a certification to check that indeed things were strictly compliant, but we gave up on that idea for obvious reasons. There is a specific guideline also on the risk assessment for all parties that are operating the proxies or that are using this architecture. So everything is in fact very strictly controlled if things are done properly.
Yes. And perhaps something to note is that with the new baseline acceptable use policy, there is actually a requirement to include for a proxy to include in its privacy statement all the individual privacy statements of the services behind it. So everything is completely transparent to users. So a user that accesses a proxy has a single point where they can see the private statements of all the services that are behind the proxy. So everything is completely transparent to the user.
So are there more questions? While I wait, if other people type, I also want to really make it clear that the BPA, this architecture, I mean, this is rather complex, clearly. It's really about building an AI for a research collaboration to manage their users, to manage access to the resources the collaboration wants to offer to external users or external other research collaborations. So it is something that we want really to target to architects, to people that have really a fair know-how about these things. This is really something that we don't want users to see, absolutely. For the goal of all this is to hide all the complexity and to make the user experience really nice and smooth, whilst all the complex bits are handled by capable people. And maybe, David, you can say something on your experience to deploy the BPA in a, actually, you are a very interesting case, I would say, because Daria is art and humanities research collaboration. So maybe you can just give a little bit your feeling on the experience in deploying the BPA.
Yeah. So I mean, on the plus side, I think in Daria we have been running the AI for Daria for, I think, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, even before the AARC BPA came around. So we had the technical knowledge in operating and designing the architecture, of course, which helped. But I think nowadays it's I mean, while there might not be a BPA for dummies sort of guide, there's at least a lot more documents and also established software solution, let's say, with which you can design these BPA compatible infrastructures. I think for us it took something like half a year to a year from basically deciding that we want to adopt the BPA into our infrastructure through the process of coming up with design plans, implementing stuff, testing stuff, and then of course migrating stuff. But I think the experience that we had, it was very much worth it. We had a lot of scalability issues before adopting the proxy architecture, and even for the service operators, it's much easier now than it was previously, where they had to basically connect to eduGain themselves and not have, let's say, the shortcut through the infrastructure proxy. So yes, you of course need someone capable to implement this stuff, and it takes quite some time, but I think it's worth it in the end.
Any more question or comment or suggestion? In the meanwhile, I can start to thank everybody for joining us in this webinar. We hope this has been useful. And of course, David and Nicholas for not only working to make this real, but also to present this. So thank you everybody for joining us. We will send the URL to the video, but you can find that on the IM Online YouTube channel. Thanks once again, and see you, or some of you, soon.